Welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Amen.
Let's make this a little larger for everyone. Good. All right, so we are still, look, there's a good deal of this poem that is saying, if you do this stuff and you're not loyal and you abandon God, there's going to be pretty awful stuff happening. And it's interesting. The poem actually takes a very interesting turn eventually. We may catch it. I don't know. It comes up fairly soon, but we need to keep going with these awful stuff happening, right? Michutz tishakel, tishakel cherev. From outside, the sword will destroy. And the idea of destruction has to do with sort of utter, like annihilation, right? Umechadarim, and from inside, ema, fear. So gam bachur, gam bachur, gam betula. So in other words, the young man and the maiden, yonek, the suckling child, im ish seva, with the old man, with the man of gray hairs. So it's universal. So let's go. Rashi just has some really interesting interpretations of these words. So, and of course, that's the thing about poetry, is that perhaps another characteristic of poetry is because it deals so in such metaphoric language, and it's just loose, it's not as direct, that it opens up possibilities of interpretation, further possibilities. So here, michutz tishakel cherev, right? From without, the sword destroys or annihilates. So he says michutz la'ir, right? From outside the city, tishaklem cherev gayasot. So by outside, he means that outside, the sword of troops, of invaders. In other words, the idea that when it's saying outside, it means they come from abroad, right? And they come in, they're going to invade, the idea of invasion. Umechadarim ema, right? And in the rooms, literally it means, right? Fear. Kesheboreach, when this person flees, v'nimlat min hacherev, and is able to escape from the sword, chadrei libo nokfim alav. Literally it means the rooms of his heart beat against him, right? In other words, that when you're scared, right, the adrenaline rush and your heart starts to beat hard. And that's the idea of the fear on the inside, meaning now, so that doesn't mean so much inside the room of the house, but rather in this interpretation, internally, both internally. Okay. Mechamat ema, on account of the terror. Vahu mate, v'holech, let me just make sure I finish, v'holech ba. All right, so it says, because that's what it looks like, vahu mate, which means, you die out of fear. The holechba means continue, something to continuously, right? So in other words, people are dying just out of the sheer terror that they're experiencing. Davar acher, another interpretation. Umechadarim ema, right? And from inside, terror. Shebabayit. So now we're saying, taking it more literally, right? That in the house, tiyeh emat dever, that inside the house we have the terror that comes from pestilence. And pestilence has to do with dread diseases, like the bubonic plague, things like that. COVID, right? Kamosh Emar, as it states in Jeremiah chapter 9, Ki Allah mavet bechalonenu. So it says in Jeremiah, for the death has come up in our windows, literally. But again, a similar kind of expression. right? Internal. V'chein tirgem unculus, and he says, and in fact, unculus translates it, the Aramaic translation follows that interpretation. Davar acher, from the Sifrei. Michutz tishakel cherev, from without the sword devours, the sword annihilates. Masha susa, interesting, he's saying that it's actually a subtle reference to the sins that they committed. Alma she'asu bachutzot, on what they were doing in the streets. So, in other words, in the interpretation of this would be, on account of what you did in the streets, the sword will devour. Shinimar, how does he get this? It states that, so you can see how beautifully the Sifrei just pulls out these really early commentaries that are so sensitive to any literary allusion. So Shinimar, it says in Jeremiah 11, Umispar chutzot Yerushalayim, and according to the number of streets in Jerusalem, samtim mizbachot levoshet, you placed up altars to the shameful thing, right? In other words, to idols. Umechadarim ema, and again, the second half of that little phrase, Alma she'asu bechadrei chadarim. It has to do with what they did in their inner sanctums, in their inner rooms, try to do so publicly and secretly. Shinamar, and here it says in Ezekiel chapter 8, Asher Ziknei Yisrael, which the elders of Israel, in other words, the leadership, right, osim, right, as that they are practicing. Ish bechadre maskito, I think it's maskito. So each one in his marbled chamber, they're practicing things that are disgusting and wrong privately. Next verse. Amarti af ahem. I said to myself, this is God, of course, speaking, or I thought to myself, af ahem. So this word af ahem is a difficult word to translate. When I looked at Sepharia, in fact, they don't even translate it to begin with. They have these interpretations that we're going to come across. But it means, so af ahem, it's Onkelos, the Aramaic, translates it as, I will release my anger against them. In other words, I thought to release my anger against them. Here we are in the Onkelos. Echol ragzi alehem. I will let out my anger, my fierce anger upon them, ve'eshetzinun, and I will destroy them. So that's this Ashbita me'enosh zichram, I will cause to cease. So the word Shabbat, right, has to do with cessation of labor, right? And that's why it has to do with rest, that idea of rest. I will cause to cease me'enosh, from a man, zichram, their remembrance. In other words, I will cause them to be forgotten, so destroyed they are. So there's a lot, Rashi has a lot to say about this af hehem, as we'll see. So, Amarti af hehem. Amarti bilibi, Rashi is paraphrasing. I said in my heart, af otam, I will af them, right? So I will destroy them. Vayesh lefaresh, and it's possible to interpret this af ahem, right, as this word af ahem, I will make them, here we go, asitem pe'ah, but I think, no, asitem pe'ah lahashlicham me'elai. I will make them like pe'ah. Pe'ah is a law regarding the corners of the field, which a farmer is supposed to leave ownerless, so that the poor and the indigent can come and help themselves freely to the food that's left in the corner of the field. So in other words, I will make the Jewish people ownerless, right? So lahashlicham me'alai, in other words, I'm not going to own them anymore. So there's something to meditate a little bit about, right? That in a sense, we are God's possession, that God owns us. I've been meditating, just parenthetically and aside, the whole issue of who owns our bodies. and that there is a unstated, although here it's being stated, but in a sense it's not stated very clearly, that actually our bodies are owned by God. And to look at our own bodies, our physical bodies, because who owns them? We didn't create ourselves. We didn't. What act of ownership did we actually do to own our bodies? So if we don't own our bodies, we're tenants in our bodies. And just like a decent tenant makes sure that the property in which they live is cared for and taken care of, so that's the way we should feel about our bodies. And also, a landlord has a right to let you know what the rules of the property are. And likewise, God has issued the rules of our body. Yes, Lauren, I see you.
Is this related to the word paya or payos, like the side locks? And if so, is there a relation in the concept of why
Yes.
that they do that?
Right. So, Lauren, this is one of the reasons why I love teaching. I never thought of it before, but the answer is yes. And I will connect the dots. So, yes, it has to do with the corners of your head, right? The corners of your hair, and to allow them to grow long. So, in other words, on that level, we're not controlling the growth by letting those corners of our hair grow long. But I think there's also that connection of then making our bodies right. In other words, we now have a physical expression of how God owns our bodies, just as letting that corner of the field go for the poor and allowing God to dictate how we treat our own property is, again, saying it all comes from God. It's a profound way of not just talking about it, not just thinking about it, not just feeling about it, but actually acting it. I mean, this, if you're following me, you're seeing just how profound this whole concept of mitzvot is. But thank you, Lauren. I did not think about that before until you raised that question as to the
Well,
significance of those peyot.
and I'm curious about the origin of that halacha, whether, it's scriptural. I assume it's scriptural, and is it
Yes.
talking about ownerlessness and
Well, the rabbis clarify that the concept of hefker, which means ownerless, right, is actually a rabbinic concept, but the Bible essentially says that you're to leave the corners of your field for the poor to come and gather. So that's how the Torah states it.
but
But
I mean the payout.
right, oh, that no, it just says, you shall not trim the side locks of your hair or your beard. It just simply says that. The Torah doesn't necessarily give you the interpretation of it,
But it
but
does it use the word payout?
yes, it does.
And
Yes.
that
And-
the connotation
or-
is ownerlessness or not being controlled.
Well, that was my interpretation based
Hmm.
on what you got me thinking. In meditating on what you had just said, it occurred to me that there was a connection between the payout of the field and the payout of your body.
Well, you confirmed what I was thinking, but
Right.
I was just curious.
Lauren, that's my job.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. So the point is that, let me find the, okay. Hafker, v'dugmato matzinu be'ezra. And we find actually a similar interpretation here in Ezra. And of course, it's not we think, I believe, that the book of Ezra was actually one long book and that it was subsequently divided into Ezra and Nehemiah. So though Rashi is referring to it as Ezra, it's actually found in the book of Nehemiah, chapter 9. And of course, Ezra and Nehemiah are contemporaries. They're post-exilic. Here we go. Vatiten lahem eretz mamlachot. I think what this means here is that I put them into lands of kingdoms, amamim, and nations, techalkem lefe'ah, and they were divided, and there it uses lefe'ah as a pe'ah. And he says lehefker. Now I don't know if the word lehefker is actually in the verse or whether this is Rashi explaining lehef, but it could be. In which case, Lauren, we now do have a connection of peah and hefker. a free-for-all.
Well, in my Rashi, actually Lephaya is in the quotation,
Right.
lehav care is not.
That's what I was suspecting, but I
Yeah,
wasn't certain because, as you can see, we don't have quotation marks. Right.
I do.
So thank you. No, it's very helpful, your edition of the text. Right. And I did not have time to go back into Nehemiah and actually look and check. So my bad. V'chein chibru Menachem. And that is how Menachem ben Saruk, I believe is his full name, again, one of the teachers that Rashi mentions, how he interpreted it. V'yesh potrim oto ketargomo, and there are those who explain it as the Targum does. Yachul rogzi alechem. May my anger be let forth freely let forth upon them. V'lo yitachen. But Rashi says this is not an accurate interpretation. That there are problems with interpreting it that way. She'imkein, because if that were the case, haya lo lichtov, it should have written that as the text in Hebrew should have been written af ahem. In other words, it shouldn't have been af ahem. It should have been af ahem. Aleph tachat. Aleph echad. This first aleph leshimush, that is as a utility letter. It's a utility letter in the sense that it indicates a first person future. I will. So the here would be I will, and afehem would be the second aleph. He says ve'achat leyesod, and one of them, the second aleph, for the root, as part of the root of the word. Kamor, and he gives an example, right, where you have these double alephs at the beginning in Isaiah 45. Azrecha. So the root is azer, right? And so this first aleph indicates I will help you, right? So, and in Job chapter 16, so Acham, sorry, let me make sure I've got this right. Let's see, sorry. There we go. Amitzchem, right? So we know that the word amitz, that's the root. And this first aleph means I will, right? Amitzchem, I will strengthen you. B'mo fiv, or b'fi, through my mouth, I will strengthen you. V'ha'aleph hatichona, and he says, and the middle aleph, this af ahem, because there's another aleph here in the word. Here we go. Do you see this aleph here? He's talking about this aleph in the middle of the root afa, something like that. Must be the root hatichona, the middle aleph. Eina ru'uya bo klal. So in that particular case, I think what he's saying is that middle aleph wouldn't even occur in that form of the word if it meant I was going to, I was going to destroy them in the way that, or let my anger, if it had to do with his anger, that middle aleph wouldn't belong there at all. The onkelos tirgem achar lashon habaraita. But having said what he said, Rashi says, the truth is that onkelos is interpreting it, translating it after the Baraita. This Baraita is an extract of Mishnaic origin, meaning it's a source that's prior to the year 200 of this era, and which is found, and it refers to, in other words, it's of Mishnaic times, but it's not found in the Mishnah. The word Baraita is an Aramaic word which means outside. So in other words, a source found outside the Mishnah, but nevertheless contemporary with Mishnaic sources. So he's saying that Onkelos found this Baraita, Hashnuya Besifrei, right? That was found in the Sifrei, in this Midrash called Sifrei. V'hacholeket teva zo l'shlosha tevat, which in fact, what it does is it sees this word as like what we've talked about, a notarikon, as an abbreviation, right? As actually an abbreviation, and in that sifrei, it divides the word af-ehem into 3 words. Amarti af, right? I said af, so here are the 3 words, af-e-hem, right? So it divides this word into 3 words, the one words into 3 words, and here's the interpretation. Amarti ba'api, I said in my anger, et nem ke'elu einam, I will make, in my anger, I made them as if they do not exist, right? Sheyomru ro'ehem alehem, that people who see these this nation, in other words, who see the Jewish people after God has released all these things upon them, ayehem. So their people are going to say, where are they? Where are these Jews? Where do they even exist anymore? So I told you this af-ehem is a very it's got a lot packed into this word af-ehem. So now we get to what's going to happen, right? There's going to be a however, lule, were it not for the fact, in other words, I would have destroyed them entirely. That is to say, the actions of the Jewish people deserved utter annihilation. Lule kas oyev agur, okay, lest, except for the fact of the taunts or the anger, kas is also anger, of the enemy, in other words, the enemies of the Jewish people who were attacking them. Agur, so it can mean it was stacked up. In other words, the enemy had filled themselves with this taunt. Pen yinakru tsaremor, lest their tsaremor means tsarehem, again their enemies, right, misunderstood them. The Hebrew is incredibly difficult here. Now, I think Ka'as Oyev Agur, Aleph, again, remember this first Aleph being the indication of the first person future. That's the way I would understand it. But Agur can also be a passive form, this form of a word. So it's from the word agar, right? So was stacked up. Pen yomru, lest they say, this is very important, lest they would think, that is the enemy would think, Yadenu Rama, our hands are at the uppermost. In other words, and again, hand represents power. In other words, it was our power that the enemies themselves thought it was that it was themselves who were able to do this. V'lo Hashem pala kol zot, and it was not Adonai who'd made this all possible. So God is more upset at the fact that all that's going on here could cause the idol worshippers to, as you will see, to attribute even more power to their own idols. And that's a result. That's the reason for not annihilating the Jewish people. Wow. What a thought, right? But nevertheless, it's part of what's going on. Let's see if we can go a little bit more and we'll finish here. But at least we're seeing that it's not going to all happen. But again, standing back, trying to look in a larger picture at what this poem is trying to say, is it's supposed to be, this insurance policy, right? That the Jewish people shouldn't have this happen to them, and trying to let them know what the consequences are if they are not loyal. Lulei kas oyev agur, right? Imlo sheka'as oyev kanus alehem. Where if it weren't for the fact that the anger of all this anger that the enemies are throwing on them, kanus alehem, okay, was gathered together over them, lahashchit, to destroy, ve'im yuchal lahem, right? And if they were able to achieve that, vayashchitem, right? And they were actually able to annihilate the Jewish people. Yitleh hagdola bo, he would assume that this all happened because of his own greatness. In other words, he would attribute the ability to do that in himself, uve lohav, and in his gods. V'lo yitleh hagdola bi, and they would not attribute this power, this ability to do this greatness in me. V'zeh shekatuv, right? Or vezesh amar pen yinakru tsaremo, and what is this? What is written, lest the enemies will attribute their to a stranger is how they're doing it. This yinakru is what Rashi is trying to interpret, and this word nechar means stranger, right? So lest their enemies attributed to a stranger, yinakru hadavar. In other words, they will misinterpret. They will misinterpret this thing. Litlot gevuratam, to make their power dependent ba'avodat kochavim, in idolatry, she'ein hagdola shelo, which doesn't, of course, have any real power whatsoever. Pen yomru yadenu rama v'gomer. So this, he stops here, says, lest they say, and that's going on. We'll see how. That's the next verse. That our hands had the upper hand. We had the upper hand, is how we could translate it. Okay, here we go. Pen yomru yadenu rama. Sorry, it's not the next verse. It's part of the same verse. So we'll continue here. Let me do this. Okay, I'm going to have to play with this later on. I'll see if I can possibly put in the marking. Let's see. Yep, that's there. All right, and I'm going to stop the share. And we'll stop the recording.